They can be as thin as 70 pages, and we have some that are 200 or 300 pages. It just depends on the individual group and author. But each one has a section on identification. This is a place where you can look to learn where the engine number is, where the VIN number is, any idiosyncrasies about those. The next section is operation and controls. How are the things supposed to work? You turn the ignition switch to the left, or you need to turn it to the right to turn on, and if vice versa. All those kinds of things, so that when we judge operability on the show field, everybody's supposed to know how things are supposed to work in theory. The next section of the manual is about the engine compartment. How does it appear? Not what the specs are for the carburetor, but how does it appear? Is the carburetor dichromate plated with a painted base, or is it finished in some other way? What color is the carburetor air cleaner? Where the decals go? What kind of radiator cap will you find? What kind of hose? Is the hose black with ribs, or black with GM logos, and those kinds of things? And we have somebody don't turn off their phone before they start. The next section is the chassis and underbody. How is the frame, suspension, how are those things finished? What's the exhaust system like? For the 40s, 50s, Cadillac, unlike GM, once the chassis was assembled, everybody assembled them the same way. You flip the frame upside down, you put in the rear end, put on certain other components, flip the chassis over, and put the rest of it back together, drop the engine on, and the transmission, and so on. But once the chassis was done, before the engine was made, everything was sprayed with chassis enamel. Whereas in Buick, for example, the frame was painted by A.O. Smith, and then the various components were put on as they were received from the supplier. Some were painted, some were not. So if you have forged steel on a Buick, it should not be painted black. It should be forged steel. There are paints that try to replicate that kind of finish. The next section in our manual is interior, and that shows you, tells you, most all the manuals have the codes that will enable you to decode from your data plate what's in the car. What was in the car when it came from the factory. And it will show you patterns of how these were finished, generally. If you have a car with a genuine Fleetwood body on it, not necessarily the case that the manual will have all the details, because Fleetwood is a whole other story, and there are a lot of individual options for customizing a Fleetwood body. If you're going to do a Fleetwood car, you should get Shield's book, which is about this thick. He just come out with the second edition, and has all kinds of details on how interiors are finished, how the exteriors are finished, which is very, very valuable and helpful for them. The next chapter, the final chapter in the book, is about, in the authenticity manuals, is the exterior. How is it painted? What's the trim look like? When we get back to the 20s and 30s cars, again, there are many, many variations and differences. And so you have to be, and so the manual tries to help you attune yourself to those things. Depending upon the author of the book, there are appendices which will include lists of places that you can get supplies from. Not all manuals will have that. Some will have 1 or 2 pages that they've copied out of some GM book because it's a idiosyncrasy of that year or that particular car that it's nice to know. But that's sort of author's choice. What are these books for? They're intended to be a guide for owners and judges to restore them and to judge the restored car. What they attempt to document is typical practice. typically done at the factory when the car was assembled. Corvette people obsess over bolt heads. You know, it has to have a certain marking line. Well, I can assure you that the assembly line at General Motors or any make never stopped while they waited to get a particular fastener if they ran out of the normal ones that was supplied. They put it together with whatever was available. You want to try and hook it up?
I can do it.
Okay. Can you hook it up while the show is in progress?
Sure can.
Okay. What a deal. So we'll let him do that. So the point is that these books attempt to show what was typical practice. But there are variations in typical practice. And if you are restoring a car, the source that can tell you, usually the best source for how the car was put together, is the car itself. Most people rush into a restoration and they take it all apart. Wrong. They also grab a hold of the pressure washer at the local service station, or maybe they have one, and they blast all that grease and everything off. Grease is good. Sort of like what the guy said, greed is good. Well, grease is good because if you have a very greasy, slimed up assembly, the odds are that if you remove that dirt carefully, you will still find the original factory markings. You will find what the finish of the part was, but you can't find it with a steam cleaner and aggressive solvents. And one of the projects I have in the shop right now is redoing the suspension on a 53 Buick. The underneath side, you couldn't get close to it unless you had a hazmat suit on. But once I got it off and cleaned the parts gently, here were all the ink, paint marks, that were left over from the assembly line when the quality control guys went through and marked it with yellow or orange or blue or green, that this assembly had been completed. If I'd have washed that with heavy-duty solvents and steam, all that would have been missed. The other thing that can be done is when you take fasteners apart, if they've never been apart before, the head of the fastener and potentially the fitted side of the nut, if you look at it closely, it will show you whether it's cadmium or black oxide or whatever. You're getting into the monitors. Yeah.
Can I bring up a couple items here?
Sure. Well, we're waiting for the projector.
Now, I'm going to bring up now, Phillips head screws were not used pre-1940. So if you see a car pre-1940, if it's got Phillips head screws, it's wrong. One item. Another item. Let me get a few items in here.
Let's take them one at a time.
Okay, go ahead.
1937 was the first use of Phillips head screws on garnish moldings on Cadillac bodies.
37.
37.
In 1936, they used a small one in the clock.
Okay.
Okay.
But general Phillips head screws, not before 37.
Yeah.
In 36, they put the little
Let's go another way. Now, again, on the firewall, if a car, an early car, say early 40s, had side mounts, it should be on the firewall, which is very important. If it's not on the firewall, the car came through without side mounts. And if the side mounts were added later, that's another ballgame. It should be on the firewall. Go ahead. Go ahead.
For what years are you talking?
Well, I'm talking 37, 8, 9, 40.
Okay. Prior to that, that's not the case. I can't tell you on the years you're talking about, but I have a problem with what you're saying in that
You just can't get it.
the firewall was, the tag on the firewall was installed by Fisher Body.
Yes.
And they had a very limited amount of information about chassis items.
on upholstery. On the 41 upholstery, the upholstery is please. Go on. We're not having a discussion.
Just kidding.
But that's the whole reason for the authenticity manuals.
Okay, there are the chapters. Everyone is arranged this way. Okay, we're talking about typical practice. These are not, when you buy these don't tell you how to do it. You need a shop manual, you need serviceman bulletins, you need other things. You need general mechanical knowledge. These don't tell you how you put it together. Why should you buy these? So you understand your car. If you like to do judging, we'd love to sell you a whole set because you never know what you're going to judge. So you need a whole set to study up before you come to the meet. But really, they will help you authentically restore your car to the best of our ability. When we're preparing these, we can't get all things correct. And so, as time goes on, like this particular manual that I was holding up, the one for 4849 is the most recent one, recently revised. It's in the second edition. We made a lot of changes. And we're still finding things that we can add to that manual to enhance it. So someday there will be a third edition, and we will put all those things in. I come back to my point about if you want the best guide for your car, though, use the car, assuming it's not a collection of parts that you buy from somebody in 3 pickup truckloads, 35 cardboard boxes. These are done by a committee of volunteers. We have a team leader. We have at least 2 of them present. Jay Friedman, stand up. Jay does the class 13. Duke Gerke is working on one for 59 and 60. Duke, you can stand up so people can know who you are. Any other manual writers that I have here?
Jim Eccleston, class 19,
Oh, yeah.
6162.
6162. You want to stand up? There you go. We have a team leader, and then depending upon how persuasive he is, we have other people that will help. The rule is we use Cadillac literature, whether that's shop manuals, parts manuals, serviceman bulletins, salesman's bulletins, trim books, everything else. If you get it out of Hot Rod Magazine or Motor Trend, we don't accept that. We also submit them to, as they're being developed, to peer review. We try to find people who don't have the time, don't have the interest in writing, if they would at least take the time to read it and say, oh, I don't agree with the fact that the air cleaner is flat black, it should be semi-gloss, whatever. And through the review process, we try to arbitrate those so that we get a consensus when we put it in the book that this is what everybody believes is correct. Sometimes we have 50-50, and so we'll print in the book. Some people think it's this, some people think it's that. Look at your car, decide accordingly, come to a judging session with the documentation. And then they're supposed to go through my review before they go to publication. Here are a list, part of the list, we'll get to the next slide, of the existing manuals that are available for purchase. Courtesy of a guy by the name of Tom Young, we have class 2 to 7 and 9 are all done. It's a sort of a heroic, I consider it to be a heroic effort, just one hell of a lot of work. And you can also buy class 2A to 7 and 9 is one big book, which is 1,200 pages. So if you're working on a lot of cars of that vintage, you might want to just buy the whole book, 1,200 pages. The next group is the final group of what we have available for sale today. these are the manuals that we have people working on. They're in various stages of development. Some from, really it boils down to a guy said, I'm going to do this. And to others that are more or less far along. Yes, Jim?
On the previous slide, I didn't see the 56 Cadillac. I thought it was in with the 54 and 55.
I have to check, Jim.
I've got a manual.
Does it say 56?
56.
Well, it could be that the guy that made these slides should have said 54 to 56, and I think you're right.
Yeah, that was it, please.
Okay, thank you. I'll have to correct that the next time I update these. The closest one to publication probably is the 63-64 at the moment, but I've given up making projections about when they're going to be done. So, anyway, that's what we're working on now. That's not all the models. As we get into the 80s, it's getting progressively worse because of all the different variations in models. So some of the things that you can do to help, if you want to help, is if you have a manual that you're using and you're restoring your car, and you find some things that are not in the manual that you think should be in the manual, you should write them down and send them to me. That's the only way we're going to find out about these things often. If you're really interested, why, you can join one of the manual committees that on this other group here and help inspire, work, do what to get those manuals into completion. And how do you help with manuals? You can write a section, you can be a peer reviewer, or you can be the guy that leads the effort. And that's the end of my slideshow. So for the next 30 minutes, we can probably should have done that.
Authentic paint, not black, say another color that was issued that same year. Would that be sufficient, or it has to be the color that left the factory?
In the Cadillac Club, the color of the car may be any color that was offered that year. So, if in 49, how many colors do we have, Jay?
15. I don't remember exactly.
15 colors is the palette that you can use. Okay? Carl?
Well, for example, 41 on 60 special, there was about 80 different colors that were delivered.
Okay. So the answer is it's if a color was available. Now, if it's not a color that's listed in a factory publication, the car could have been painted that color. Rosemary pink. In which case, you should have some documentation that that's how the car was delivered, and your Fisher body data plate better say SP, underpaint, or be blank. Either way. Am I correct on blank or SP?
Probably SP.
SP is normal, but sometimes I think that
SO.
SO, special order.
Yeah,
You go to these outdoor shows, they ask you if your car is supposed to be the color, and if you don't have the right color, a lot of judges will tell you that your car's not going to win when they go to the next car.
Well,
I've been that way too.
well, the other thing we can comment on here is what is done under CLC rules.
Well, under CLC rules, typically, we don't take judgment. So if you have a wild pink color on a 1937 Cadillac, it's probably going to be an authenticity deduction. If it is a reasonably muted color, even though it doesn't match the paint code on the tag, chances are the judges are not going to make a deduction. They'll accept it as standard judging practice in Cadillac LaSalle.
Let's go with the seats. Now, in 41, the seats were all pleated. In 40, they were all plain seats. Now, if you have pleated seats in 40, are points going to come off?
If the judge is knowledgeable, has enough authenticity knowledge, that is a logical deduction. The trick is, and the problem is, having enough judges who have studied the authenticity manuals or own the cars of that vintage to where they are that knowledgeable. But in fact, you're correct. There should be a deduction for an incorrect upholstery.
Now, let's go on the color of the upholstery. Yes, Carl?
So you're referring to a limited knowledge of cars you've dealt with.
Yes.
If you get into the factory special orders and everything else, what you're saying no longer holds.
No more. All right, Carl.
Can I ask you something about with the colors? I judge NCRS,
Right.
and I've seen 53 Corvettes, polo white, not one the same color.
Yeah.
How authentic, I mean, is there a guide shows this was a color swatch, and then we add
I understand you're talking about variations in color.
variations of the same color?
Yeah. And
Not yet.
it's impossible. And in the Cadillac Club, we just don't bother. Okay, if it's a metallic royal, it's what the eye can discern.
Mhm.
Okay, I mean, so if it's supposed to be a metallic dark blue, and it really is sky blue, well then no, that doesn't work. But if it's a metallic dark blue, whether it's dark or a little less dark,
Yeah.
To show you just how impossible that is, I spent a lot of years in production and production engineering in General Motors, particularly in Fisher Body. It was impossible to even match the paint from the front fenders to the body in a lot of cases, because Fisher Body painted the body, the motor divisions painted the front end sheet metal. So at my home plant in Janesville, Wisconsin, we solved the problem by one vendor supplying half of the colors to both Chevrolet and Fisher Body, and the other vendor, one of them was PPG and the other was DuPont. The other vendor supplied the other half of the colors to both Chevrolet and Fisher Body to guarantee that the sheet metal would match the body. In some cases, the difference was extreme to the point that you can't sell this car, and you wind up repainting one half of it. So to be exact on the shade and the metallic flop and all on paint, you can't get
I
there.
got white diamonds, and it's really hard to match that. I mean,
Oh, I can go one step deeper. I supply both Ford and GM, and each year has different color standards. The only way you can keep a color standard is totally in the dark, and even then it will age depending on the
Oh, yeah.
formulation.
Yeah, if you used to buy paint chips at a swap meet, I'll guarantee you every one of those colors is wrong.
What about the upholstery colors? They would left the factory with a dead beige or a tan, or whatever left the factory with, and you're going to put a red color in there instead of a beige, would that be acceptable in the upholstery business?
If the color is extreme and you don't have an SO on the body tag, it's susceptible to a deduction.
That's just that, yeah.
Sure. But particularly as you go back in age, the trim codes on the body tag, or translating the trim codes on the body tag to an actual fabric and color gets to be almost impossible.
So it's the same deal as a paint.
The Cadillac LaSalle Club Museum Archives has 300 or 400 fabric samples from the early 30s to the early 40s. They've been kept in the dark, and those
accounts from the dealerships that have been properly kept. And I hope that eventually the archives gets a full collection of those. But as you get back, on earlier than 1940 or so, those battery swatches are pretty rare, pretty few and far between.
They are. I have a 30 packet, a rumble seat roadster Super 8. Now, in the rumble seat roadster, in the 30 packet, the Super 8, which was the top of the line packet, which equivalent was to Cadillac. Now, I just changed and I put beige leather into the seats. It came with beige leather, supposedly. Now, you know how many shades of beige leather there is? Beige,
You make your own
shade.
point.
Beige leather.
You make your own point.
I make
You
my own
just
point.
can't get there from here on exactly.
Yeah. Well, and between Fisher and Fleetwood, between the two, there was also variation between the Fisher and Fleetwood. So if you had a custom made by, like I have a V16. It's really a custom made car. It was made handmade, because they made 10 cars on a V16. So it's a custom made car. How are you going to figure all that kind of different stuff into a V60?
Yeah. And then if the fabric color is reasonable and the soap pattern is reasonable for the era,
That's what
it's accepted. It has to be.
Yeah, well, Fran Rocks has made two Cadillac
Sure
with
did.
Fleetwood bodies based off illustrations in the Fleetwood sales books that were never made. The cars were never manufactured, but he made them, what, 5 years ago? No,
They're 15 years ago.
yeah, 15, yeah.
Now, I have a 38 V16.
Let me go back here. Jim had a question.
Back in '98, when I bought my '56, the interior needed dramatic help,
Right.
to say the least. And the code on the firewall was 90. I looked through every Cadillac publication I could get my hands on, and it wasn't there. I called Jan Saunders. He said, it's a beige tan, isn't it? I mean, a mohair tan. I said, I'll go fast as close as we can get. I'm not sure that the 56 manual is updated to include code 90.
Okay.
But it is. That was what it was. And I know when we took the...
Send me an email.
Send me an email. When we took the doors apart, they were stamped on the inside, 1956.
Right.
But it is motor.
That's what I mean. The car tells the story.
It does, yeah.
Okay, when I was painting my 36 LaSalle DuPont over here, 2 miles from my house, I went over to him to mix the paint. The guy says, we can't mix the paint and the color, the old colors are.
Right.
I says, okay, I got these color charts that I bought. I have 3 different ones, and they all did different colors. Great. These color charts, when they sit around their lacquer, they change color. They said, even the big boss came down and says, just pick something that comes close, because when you scratch the car, you can get the paint made. Okay? Then my 40 LaSalle, I just put an interior a year ago, and 5 different people that bought the splashes, they all buy it from the place in England. And the one with the stripes I got, there's different color stripes, none of them have the red stripe in it. You buy what you can get. You get the pattern, you get 4 of the colors, but the 5th color is not in there, the red stripe. So you can only get what you can buy.
Hey Bill, I just had my car, well I had it, I think it was 5 years ago, I had the car painted PPG paint, and I've had the hood out, had a scratch in it, took it in to have it painted. I had the DuPont code, the PPG code, the Ditzler code, the R&M code, and the guy said, we're coming out to scan the car. And what I found out, they tend to like to come out and scan the car, even if they have all the different old codes, because that's really the only way you're going to get it reasonably close to what that color is.
Now, if you're matching paints, we fortunately now have spectrophotometers. Assuming you can get a large enough patch of the paint where you can get a good shot. It takes the camera, I call it camera, the instrument that takes the picture has an opening that's about so around and a gasket around it. So you've got to have a decent area to work with.
Well, I had an advantage because mine had got painted 5 years ago, and I did the clear coat, so it had sat inside for 4 or 5 years, no fade, no wear. And so the guy absolutely refused to use the coats. He says, for me to get it exact, I'm going to have to come out and scan that paint color. Because I'm using DuPont, you used PPG, and even between the PPG and the way they mixed that 5 years ago, it could be different.
Exactly.
But going back to the original question, I mean, if you technically took it to the extreme, you could have people out there scanning your cars to see if it come within some kind of, range.
We're not going to do that.
You're not going to do that. If it looks,
Relax.
yeah.
Even the Corvettes don't do that. I mean,
No.
it's...
Yes, they do.
They're paying for it. They actually colors.
Huh?
Corvettes change colors from the fiberglass.
Oh, yeah. But I wasn't aware that they were using spectrophotometers on the paint.
Oh, I don't know
No,
about that.
they're trying to get a standardization.
Well, I understand that, but it's very difficult. Because even in the production year, there were it's not great, but there were variations. You couldn't take an early assembly car and set it wrong side of a late assembly car and expect the paint to match exactly. But it was close. I mean, total white is not, gray.
So when you talk them all in a row.
Yeah, they're all different.
In the sun, it's like, which one's real?
You had a question?
On one of your presentations, you showed that there were 2 different manuals for the V16. What's the difference in the 2 manuals?
Let's go back and get there and look at it. One way or another.
One you said was maybe down to
Oh, no.
It's just included in a clear manipulation. The one is in the
Okay. Now that we're back to there.
They're right there.
Okay.
See, 6 as opposed to 7 and 8.
Yeah, 6 goes 30 to 33.
Yeah.
V12s and V16s.
Yeah.
And
I think 7 to 9 and 34 to 37.
Plus the 36 to 38.
I think I've listed that one wrong. I will tell you. Let me get the master list.
Yeah, a lot of you shoot like
7 is 36 to 37.
No, if you can find somebody who's willing to take a chance to do it for you on a weekend or something.
California, absolutely no lack.
Not in most of them. There's a few areas that they could, but there's no restorers up there.
A lot of paint appearance has to do with the application. The 31 Cadillac that's now in Cadillac LaSalle Museum is painted with base coat, clear coat. I defy you to walk up to the car and look at it and tell me that it's not polished lacquer. If you have a 36 Cadillac with deep metallic and so much clear on it, it looks a foot thick, that's wrong. And it gets to be another one of those judgment calls on the part of the judges.
Personally, I favor single stage, not base coat, clear coat, urethane for any solid color. Any solid color. And I'll tell you what, it's in my interest and in my customer's interest because base coat, clear coat, 2 coats of base at least, maybe 3, to get good coverage. And that's hours, that's not minutes to do a car. And then you got to do the clear coat on top of that. And that's 3 or 4 more trips around the car. And when we get done, you're going to sand them anyway. That's how we make them look nice. And I used to use, it's hard to get it anymore, acrylic enamel. And with a hardener in that, you can color sand that as well. And that was before really single stage urethanes got going good. But if you use any metallic paint, you have to clear coat it. Okay? And the new thing about the waterborne colors is, at least with PPG, you can match color better with a waterborne base coat. They still all use solvent-based clear coats for top. There's no waterborne clear coat on the top. But the biggest problem is changing your mindset in terms of cleaning your gun and what kind of a gun you have to make sure that if you're using waterborne, you have to have all stainless steel. The far bigger problem for me with using waterborne paints is drying. You need good drying equipment to dry the waterborne paints that you can't do. I mean, with solvent-based paints, you can paint them in your driveway. You can paint them in a garage with a fan that's just big enough to pull out the vapor so you don't die, assuming you're wearing a face mask and so on. But you really don't need a spray booth as long as you're halfway clean and you're halfway light. And you know how to fix it when the bug falls in. But with waterborne paints, it's a horse of it's different technology, and you really need good drying equipment to use those paints successfully. But that's the way the business is going. And if you talk to anybody that's doing high-end hot rods with really fancy paint coats, just the painters, not the guys who build the hot rods, but just the painters, because there's about 15 or 20 of those guys around the country. They're all pretty much going to the waterborne bases because they like the flexibility they get with that kind of paint. Okay, 5 minutes and then I'm gone.
One more question. Now,
Can I get the guy in the back who's had his hand up, Joe?
Just one question. Cars especially, I noticed the 70s are going to be coming out in that manual. I know especially during the 70s they reserved the Cadillac Reef and Crest for the Fleetwood products. On the V, Cadillac V and the Crest were used on DeVille products. You see quite often people who have put Reef and Crest hood ornaments, Reef and Crest hubcaps, and you see it even at Cadillac shows. Is that something that you're going to deduct? Or because that is an accessory that Cadillac sold, are you going to let that stand? It's not authentic to the car as well.
I understand what you're saying. We got the chief judge, deputy chief judge, and they got their hands in their pockets and they're all under the table.
It really bothers me when I see it.
Let me tell you this.
You're going to weigh in.
At the risk of being assassinated. Dealers did a lot of things. They put skull cap, vinyl tops on. They put stripes on. They put wreaths around the keyhole. None of which was Cadillac authorized. So what we have tried to do is stay with Cadillac authorized stuff. The dealer can pull things off his parts shelf. We saw a couple of really nice Eldorados yesterday in the car collection we viewed. One of which had the Cadillac Reef and Crest on the front of the hood, 67 Eldorado. And then somebody had taken the front extension of the hood center molding and replaced it with a later one with the upstanding Reef and Crest. So you look at there's two Reef and Crest. Wrong. Despite the fact that the dealer sold a lot of those to the point where the story was the other center molding tips got thrown in a box and somebody said, hey, I got a whole box full of those things at home. So, but while the parts were on the shelf, Cadillac didn't release them that way. And that really has to be the gold standard.
Well, yes, Jay.
It's a slightly different situation. In '49,
first half a year or so, there were no fuel filters, external fuel filters attached to the carburetor. Beginning halfway through the year, they came that way from the factory. They were not an option. The factory just installed, must have been some problem. Dealers from that date onwards offered them as a retrofit for the earlier cars. So in the authenticity manual for 49, we said an early car can have a fuel filter, but a later car must have a fuel filter, even though the earlier ones didn't come that way from the factory.
And then that's assuming that the people that judge the 49 on the field are some of those people that understand, you know, maybe yes and definitely yes. So one of the situations that exists in the Cadillac Club is when the car is judged, is the knowledge base of the judges that judge your particular car. And Carl tries to assign people to the cars that experience from records should know the cars. But since we do not have judges that we can guarantee will come to this meet, we don't necessarily have people that are knowledgeable about a particular car. And so that's a problem we face. Unlike NCRS, where at every meet, there are people, you can only judge 63s if you are proving yourself to be a 63 knowledgeable person and have been trained on 63s. So we don't have that luxury, that flexibility in the Cadillac Club. So the thing is, if you've got a judging problem, you should take it up right on the field with the team captain right at the time, and he should bring to you any significant deductions he's going to make.
Yeah, that's a must.
And you guys, the two of you should work it out. And if necessary, get out the books, get out the photos. I mean, I go back to this thing about when I restore a car for a customer, typically there's a photographic record of somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 photographs. I try to take everything before, during, and after as part of the restoration process. And so if there's an issue, we can have a discussion about what's what. So we're going to turn you over to Craig now, Craig Wood, in a minute, and talk about speedometers, I guess. And I thank you for your attention. And not throwing it.
I've been doing this since I was 17. Some cars that are 75, 80 years old, and they've been through 18 mechanics. So some stuff you can't even go by